Good evening, curious minds of the interwebs. I'm Alexa, the resident ooky spooky girly, and today we're diving into places that I'm sure even the most curious amongst us never want to visit. Prisons. I hope you're ready to be scared, because welcome to the top 5 dark secrets of the world's most dangerous prisons. Number 5, Guantanamo Bay. I figured it would make sense to kick today off with the most infamous prison on our list. If I had $1 for every time I've made a reference to punishment being worse or equivalent to something at Guantanamo, I'd be able to afford a home in Toronto by now. Back in April of 2011, WikiLeaks, along with the New York Times, NPR, and The Guardian, and other independent news organizations, began publishing 779 formerly secret documents relating to detainees. This event was referred to as the Guantanamo Bay Files leak, or the Guantanamo Files, or Gitmo Files for short. The documents consist of classified assessments, interviews, and internal memos about detainees, which were written by the Pentagon's Joint Task Force, Guantanamo, headquartered at Guantanamo Bay Naval Base. The documents are marked secret, and NOFORN, which is information that is not to be shared with representatives of other countries. So, what were the deep dark secrets? Oh, no biggie, just more than over 150 innocent Afghanistan and Pakistani folks, including farmers, chefs, and drivers, were held for years without charges. The documents also revealed that some of the prison's youngest and oldest detainees, who include an 89-year-old man and a teen, suffered from fragile mental and physical conditions, to the shock and surprise of nobody. So, what happens there? Well, legally speaking, we don't know a heck of a lot, but let's cover what we do know. Folks in charge over at Gitmo are allowed to use what are officially called enhanced interrogation techniques, which is systematic punishment of detainees in ways that most of us consider unethical. The techniques included forced nudity, painful stress positions, sleep deprivation, hypothermia, and until 2003, waterboarding. Pretty sure they still use it unofficially, so let's break down how they do that and other icky torment stuff. So the prisoner in question would be bound to a declined board with their feet raised and head slightly below the feet. Material is wrapped over their face and water is poured over them, asphyxiating the prisoner. To elaborate more on stress positions, it's where prisoners are forced to stand, handcuffed, and with their feet shackled to a bolt in the floor or wall for more than 40 hours, which creates an intense amount of pressure on the legs, leading first to pain and then muscle failure. There's also abdomen strike, where a hard, open-handed slap is dealt to, the prisoner's abdomen. Doctors consulted over the matter advised against using a punch, which could apparently cause lasting internal damage, because, I'm so glad they decided which of the two is most humane. Granted, we don't want it getting confused with an insult slap, which is an open-handed slap delivered to the prisoner's face to cause pain and fear. Lastly, there's the dreaded shaking. I promise it is actually scary, where an interrogator forcefully grabs the front of the prisoner's shirt and shakes the prisoner. See, the strikes and shaking are just stuff I've experienced by working in public entertainment, so, good to know I can endure that. Number 4, Diyarbakir Prison. So this prison is a prison located in the town of the same name in southeastern Turkey. It was established in 1980 as an E-type prison by the Ministry of Justice. After the September 12th of 1980 Turkish coup d'etat, the facility was transferred to military administration and became a martial law military prison, which if that sounds bad, it was. The period of barbarity nickname given to the establishment refers to this time period, where the prisoners were exposed to horrific acts of systemic torment. Between 1981 to 84, at least 34 prisoners lost their lives. Words like disco and theater were used by guards as substitutes for grim acts of hell, such as administering physical punishment and stripping inmates naked. Among the most common practices were severe and systemic physical torment, pulling of hair, being blindfolded and hosed, solitary confinement, guards' insults, constant and relentless surveillance and intimidation, death threats, sleep, sensory, water, and food deprivation for extensive periods, tormenting the soles of feet, stress positions similar to Gitmo, excessive exercise in extreme temperatures, stretching, squeezing, or crushing of limbs and genitalia, piling of naked prisoners on top of each other, asphyxia and mock execution, electric shocks, and specifically electrodes attached to genitalia, burning with cigarettes, extraction of nails and healthy teeth, sexual humiliation and harm, rectal examinations, forcing prisoners to urinate on each other, and more. It's claimed the dog of the guard captain, which was a German shepherd, was trained to bite the genitalia of inmates after they were stripped naked. More awful reports say that some inmates were forced to sexually harm each other, while there were also threats of sexual violence against family members. Allegedly, when a new prisoner arrived at the prison, Captain Isat met him at the entrance and then would turn to a guard and say, "Prepare him a bath and then take him to the dormitory." Now, this isn't any kind of regular bath or transportation. Almost 20 guards would accompany the prisoner to a welcoming thrashing, and then he would be dragged unconscious to the bath, which was a bathtub full of human feces in which they left the prisoner for a few hours. Yeah, that almost made me hurl. Anybody else? Some members of the prisoners were part of the Kurdistan Workers' Party, PKK, and set themselves on fire inside the prison in protest. Many prisoners died after taking their own lives, also from hunger strikes and torment, while a number of others were physically harmed to death. Control of the prison was returned to the Ministry of Justice on May 8th of 1988, but it's still an awful place.
Number 5. Eastern State Penitentiary. Starting off the list is Eastern State Penitentiary. It was a prison built in Philadelphia that wanted to stand out from the rest of the American penal system, trying out a new method of punishment called the Pennsylvania system. Well, do tell, what is the Pennsylvania system? It's not pleasant and has absolutely nothing to do with cheesesteaks. The Pennsylvania system refers to imposing the prisoners to solitary confinement all of the time, 24/7. The prisoners lived alone, ate alone, exercised alone, and were only ever allowed to interact with prison guards. When they were being transported or moved around the prison, the guards would make them don black hoods. Guess it's not nearly as sunny in Philadelphia as Frank Reynolds would have you believe. Now this might not surprise you, but this was not a terribly popular system with inmates. The miserable conditions made the inmates' lives horrendous, but the prison didn't care too much. The system only ended up collapsing in 1913 due to overcrowding in the prison. But Eastern State didn't let this stop them from acting sadistically, and really if anything just inspired them to get a little more creative. Prisoners would have their tongues chained to their wrists. Unruly, troublesome prisoners would be chained to chairs for days on end. They would douse prisoners in freezing cold water, and perhaps worst of all, would trap prisoners into a pit they affectionately nicknamed the Hole, where they'd be kept in the darkness for weeks on end. I'm really not sure if that's any better than the original system. In 1970, after decades of terrorizing its inmates, Eastern State let the last of its inmates free and closed the gates permanently, only to crack them back open a little bit as a tourist location, reopening its walls as a haunted attraction. Due to its horrific history and ominous atmosphere, the prison was rebranded as a haunt, with legends saying that you'll hear all kinds of disembodied laughter, screaming and crying, ghostly figures, shadows moving across the wall, and unexplained footsteps. And if you're looking for more scary stories about prisons or really about anything, then you're at exactly the right place. Stay subscribed to Top 5 Scary for more new scary videos every day. Number 4. Ohio State Reformatory. Ohio State is the picture of a perfect prison. I mean, literally, it was the set for the Shawshank Redemption, so it's kind of a big deal in the prison world. The prison first opened its gates in 1890 and was initially an intermediate penitentiary, a facility for first-time offenders who were deemed too violent to be in other prisons. The inmates were taught basic trades for release and reintegration. However, the prison population started to swell too much by the 20th century, and the reformatory was forced to accept inmates convicted of serious crimes. While day-to-day operations weren't too terribly out of the norm for any other prison, one event in the 1930s may have contributed greatly to the paranormal rumors surrounding it. In the late 1930s, a riot broke out in the East Cell Block, and as punishment, the guards rounded up 120 rioters to share 12 solitary confinement cells together for a week without any food or water. Obviously, this led to multiple prisoners passing away, and even more being broken down to the point of madness. Just outside the prison stands 215 numbered graves, a monument to all the horror that the prison had experienced over the years. Since then, the prison itself has reformed, rehabilitating itself much like Eastern State as a haunted house. Visitors and tour guides who walk through Ohio State report feeling inexplicable chills while walking through the prison's walls. Witnesses say they hear cell doors slam and see dark figures. Those brave enough are welcome to take the prison's tour and attempt to track down spirits of their own, or if you're feeling particularly festive for the Halloween season, you can try the Haunted Prison Experience, a guided tour replete with animatronics and actors for that haunted house feel.
Number 3. Rikers Island. Okie dokie, hands up. Who else mostly knows about this prison because of watching way too many episodes of Law and Order growing up? Just me? Okay. So Rikers Island, aka New York City's main jail complex, and the island it sits on, is situated on the East River, between Queens and the Bronx. As one of the largest correctional institutions in the world, the facility comprises 10 jails, which have a total capacity of nearly 17,000 people, which is more folks than if you double the population of my hometown when I was growing up. Pretty wild to think about. It's been referred to as the world's largest penal colony. Fun fact, back in 1884, in order to prepare for the facility's construction, a foundation of garbage, landfill, and street dirt was dumped on the island to expand the grounds. Even after Rikers Island officially opened in 1932, landfill continued to be added to the property until 1943. So because it was built on top of a landfill, it leaks methane as the waste below decomposes over time. Workers and detainees have complained about mysterious smoke plumes and the strong chemical odor that engulfs the site, especially during the summer. To add to mounting issues with air quality, 5 power plants are also situated less than a mile away from the prison in Queens, and some corrections officers even believe that the toxic chemicals may be carcinogenic and filed suit in 2011. And due to this unstable foundation, Rikers Island is especially prone to sinking and shifting. As air pockets rise up from underneath the site, the ground can resettle to fill in the gaps. This contributes to the crumbling infrastructure of the facility, making it vulnerable to flooding and other natural disasters. As the ground shifts, water pipes located underground also crack or move. In addition, the deteriorating of the building themselves have created a fertile ground for the creation of DIY weapons inside the jail. Now, if that isn't bad enough for y'all after the last two horrible prisons I talked about, don't worry, I'm getting to it. In a 2009 Daily News article, writers Joe Gold and Rich Shapiro reported on a secret sadistic Rikers Island society called The Program, which was operated by facility guards. According to attorney Antonia Madera, they allowed a group of inmate enforcers, known as the Team, to physically harm and humiliate other prisoners, and sometimes the guards also participated in the program. The hellish scheme remained under wraps until an inmate, Christopher Robinson, who was 18 at the time, was brutally killed. Now, Madera consequently filed a lawsuit against the city in February of 2008, which was settled for over $22,000. Undertraining of corrections officers continues to result in brutal treatment of inmates. It was reported that in 2013 alone, use of excessive force by officers resulted in over 1,000 injuries among an adolescent population of only 791. If you do the math, that's way too close to double the amount of injuries to prisoners for my liking. Negligence by corrections facility officers have led to lawsuits and settlements, including a $5.75 million payout for Bradley Ballard in 2013, who was found in a cell only after 6 days, a $2.75 million payout in July of 2014 for the wrongful death of Ronald Spear, who died of blunt force trauma to the head, and a $2.75 million payout in December of 2014 for Jerome Murdo, who died from being in a mental health unit that was over 100 degrees. In 2021, photos emerged showing dozens of men crammed together for days in temporary holding cells during the global panini. Filthy floors were sullied with rotten food, maggots, urine, feces, and more. People were using plastic sheets for blankets, cardboard boxes for beds, and bags that substituted for toilets. During a 5-day period in mid-September of 2020, shortly before most intake processes were moved to the Eric M. Taylor Center, at least 105 inmates were inside the crowded cells long after they should have been moved, according to records. In just that time period, one detainee was inside the intake area for 6.5 days, 22 stayed between 5 and 6 days, and 80 were there between 2 to 5 days, according to records. And this is an area where folks are supposed to be for 24 hours or less. Inside those specific chambers, inmates had very little access to food, which routinely ran out. There was little, if any, access to fresh air, toilets, toilet paper, showers, or medical care, and inmates were routinely denied visits with their attorneys and trips to the courthouse for hearings on their pending cases. Some of the only water inmates were able to drink came from tiny sinks inside the pens, and without cups, detainees used their unwashed hands to scoop up sips, or put their mouth under the faucets. Now, this has since allegedly been resolved, but jeepers. So for decades, the mere mention of Tadmor Prison was enough to send chills down anyone's spine. The notorious facility in the desert of central Syria was where thousands of folks were reported to have been beaten, humiliated, and systemically tormented for opposing the Assad family's rule. The sprawling prison was located a few miles east of Palmyra, a desert oasis famous for its Roman-era colonnades, temples, and artifacts. Located about 250 kilometers northeast of Damascus, Tadmor Prison is part of a walled-off military complex that includes military and civilian units as well as an airbase. Former prisoners say it could hold up to 7,000 inmates, so not the biggest place I've talked about today, but still rather large in size. The most well-known incident in this history came in June of 1980, a day after members of the Muslim Brotherhood staged a failed assassination attempt against Hafez Assad. In retaliation, troops belonging to Assad's brother Rafat reportedly entered the prison and killed up to 1,000 prisoners who belonged to the Brotherhood. Afterwards, the government took bulldozers from a nearby place to dig mass graves in the nearby Olymer Mountain just north of the town. One former prisoner, Abu Den, remembers that when he first entered the prison, he had to walk blindfolded and handcuffed between 2 rows of men who kicked, pushed, and hit him with clubs and metal rods. His nose was broken and he bled profusely. He still bears the marks on both of his legs, as well as his permanently dislocated right arm. Now, he recalls the warden telling a gathering of detainees shortly after they arrived that you have come to your end, there is no mercy here. God is prohibited from entering the jail. We are God and decide if you live or die. This man was regularly physically tormented and humiliated during the 4 years and 8 months he spent there. The jailers never referred to him with his real name, calling him number 13 instead. He was held in a cell with about 150 inmates who all shared one bathroom. So for food, each prisoner received 3 loaves of bread, an olive, and a teaspoon of marmalade a day, as well as 1 egg that was shared amongst 5 inmates. Prisoners were completely cut off from the outside world. Abu Den recalled that the first time he knew that the Berlin Wall fell and the Soviet Union collapsed was in 1993, which was well after those events actually happened. He broke down when he recalled looking through a keyhole and seeing a soldier urinating the food that he and those in his cell were about to eat one day. He refused to eat, but didn't have the courage to tell the others what he had seen for fear of being killed by his jailers, so instead he told his fellow fellow inmates that he wasn't feeling well. Now, the prison has since been demolished, causing controversy amongst those who wished for it to remain as a museum of history to avoid the risk of the horrors being erased from public memory. Number 1. Kwang Central Prison. It's a men's prison in Nonthaburi Province, Thailand, on the Keo Phraya River about 11 kilometers north of Bangkok. So Kwang is the site of the men's death row and execution chamber of Thailand. And as of 2018, the prison had about 6,000 inmates. All prisoners are required to wear leg irons for the first 3 months of their sentences, and specifically death row inmates are required to have their leg irons permanently welded on. Even those who are sick have to be shackled, and often to another inmate. Allegedly, the inmates are forced to live in cramped cells with no mattresses or toilet facilities. When in their cells, prisoners have only 1 square meter of space instead of the 4 to 6 meters as recommended by the Council of Europe. Prison meals in Thailand consist of unidentifiable vegetables and rotting meat, so enjoy having your stomach turn at the thought. Believe it or not, crime victims in Thailand are often treated as criminals. For instance, a Brit was charged for defending himself after he'd been attacked by a Thai gang. Although the man suffered serious injuries and had his eyeball replaced, he was charged with fighting back. Speaking of fighting, many prisoners, including tourists, are forced to fight for their freedom, which is a practice that dates back to the 18th century when the Burmese people defeated Thailand's old capital, Ayutthaya.
The prison was nicknamed The Walls, and shortly after its construction was already home to 2,000 inmates, doubling that size in the progressing years. The prison was home to several riots and escape attempts, with the most infamous attempt occurring in 1954, when some 2,500 inmates participated in a massive day-long riot. 4 buildings burned and the National Guard was called in. Shockingly, out of this, only 4 inmates were fatally injured during this event, and none managed to escape, lending to the prison's hard reputation. Now, the prison has always been reported to be haunted, even during its operation, with both guards and inmates during its service claiming to see spectral apparitions. Most of the ghost stories come out of the prison's oldest building, the A building, home to some of the crueler punishments, including an underground room called the Dungeon, a dank, hostile basement with a low ceiling forcing prisoners into a subservient position where the only light that could be observed was a slit through the door. Modern visitors to the dungeon complain of the disgusting odor of bodies that's pungent, and they feel like they're being watched. Disembodied voices have even been picked up by EVP monitors while wandering through the dungeon. In the control room, visitors report occasionally seeing a spirit called Fast Jack, a medical practitioner from the prison's operating days, who can be seen appearing as a ghastly figure holding a clipboard and a white lab coat, frantically scurrying around the control room trying to carry out some duty from when he was alive, slamming lockers and opening doors. Several ghost hunting groups over the years have investigated the Missouri State Pen, including legendary ghost hunting hero Zach Baggins and the Ghost Adventures crew, finding mysterious voices and what looked like shadow people wandering the halls. Although the bloodiest 47 acres in America might have dried up and the walls are now open to the public, for the inmates who are still impounded there, it's as terrifying as ever. Number 2. West Virginia Penitentiary. Almost heaven. West Virginia, Blue Ridge Mountains, and haunted prisons. The Appalachians might be home to one of the most beautiful parts of the United States, but West Virginia Penitentiary is anything but. In 1863, after West Virginia seceded from Virginia Classic, the new fledgling state needed its own prison, and Moundsville, West Virginia was chosen as the home for their new state pen. The prison's conditions were unlivable. West Virginia Penn frequently made the Department of Justice's top 10 violent prisons in the country. Idea for a new video. An infamous spot in the prison was known as the Sugar Shack, a small rec room for the inmates that served as a hotbed for all kinds of violent illegal activity. The prison is also home to a famous electric chair that an inmate was forced to build, nicknamed Old Sparky. Old Sparky is still standing there today. In the 1950s, the prison was so overcrowded that 3 prisoners at a time would be shoved into one cramped 7 by 5 foot cell. The men were kept like animals in cages. Riots and violent outbursts were fairly commonplace. The prison was overcrowded, dilapidated and run down, and staffed by overwhelmed guards. Eventually, the prison would be forced to open its gates, decommissioning as a prison and shipping all of its inmates elsewhere. The building still stands and is used as a training facility for law enforcement officers, but it's been said that the spirits of those whose lives ended here still wander. Hunters report equipment malfunctioning walking by the Sugar Shack, or any of the cell blocks where the more violent inmates were housed. Reports of banging on the walls late at night, as well as random screams, are fairly commonplace too. The prison was reportedly haunted while inmates still populated it, with some of the earliest stories of hauntings stemming from the 1930s. It's thought that the prison was built on top of an indigenous gravesite of the Adena people, which has led to some speculation as perhaps an explanation for the hauntings. Like most of the prisons on this list, if you're curious enough yourself, West Virginia Penn is available to visit for tours, and you can even pop by the Sugar Shack and Old Sparky. And finally, number 1, Alcatraz. Alcatraz might very well be the United States' most infamous prison. On Alcatraz Island, just outside of San Fran, lies the notorious jail, built to house America's most deadly inmates, like Al Capone, Arthur Barker, or George Kelly. It was home to a legendary breakout that was made into a film, Escape from Alcatraz, and also set the stage for Michael Bay's action classic The Rock, which was about breaking into Alcatraz. The prison was built to drain the hope out of inmates, to break the spirits of the most rebellious inmates, and was legendary for its awful conditions. Tiny cramped cells, indifferent guards, and frequent bouts of violence and riots were all commonplace. It was once referred to as the Great Garbage Can of San Francisco, where every other federal prison dumped their worst apples. So it's no surprise, given its brutal conditions, that the island is home to several spirits and hauntings from souls that just can't move on. Most ghost investigators report that the hottest spot for paranormal activity in the building is cell 14D, a cell that was also nicknamed the Hole. Gotta wonder if they borrowed that from Eastern State. It was where the most unruly prisoners would be kept when they were being difficult. It's been said that even walking by 14D, you'll immediately feel something's wrong, as if a dark presence or energy is in the room with you. An inmate once spent his last days in 14D, screaming that he was being hunted by an otherworldly creature. Visitors report hearing crying and moaning while walking through cell blocks A, B, and C, where most of the population would have been kept. It's said that a ghost named the Butcher walks through these halls after an inmate named Butcher Malkowitz, a mob hitman, was whacked by another inmate. Now, if this isn't enough haunting for you, some dark tourists also report hearing discordant, disembodied banjo strumming, thought to be a holdover from the spirit of Al Capone, who used to play his banjo in the prison band. Although the prison was decommissioned in 1963, it reopened shortly after, now as a museum and a haunted tour popular with Bay Area locals and visitors curious about learning about one of America's darkest prisons, and perhaps its most haunted. Visit if you dare, but just make sure you're able to leave.
Coming in at number 5, everything is scary on day 1. This is probably the most ideal starting point because of course prison is absolutely terrifying, but nothing is as terrifying as the very first day in your cell. User Foot Peter recounts his experience the first time he was incarcerated. I quote, "Day 1, everything is just scary as can be. You don't really know where you'll be safe, if anywhere. Every time you're passing someone, are they going to shank you? Are they going to cold cook you in your face?" I don't know what that means. Chow time was total panic mode. Hundreds of violent thugs in a close group outnumbering the guards 25 to 1. If something went down, you would be dead before order was restored. When incidents happened, you have to hide but not cower. You have to keep your back to the wall so you can fend off any incoming attacks. So the first chow time a fight broke out was the scariest time I was there. As days went on, you became more aware of when to be alarmed, but there are plenty of sneak attacks that come when all is calm. One time during morning chow, he loves the word chow, a goon squad of a few people were coming to get someone and they had to pass my direction. They weren't coming after me, but I didn't know that until they passed me. That was another scary moment. I was almost frozen, yet ready to throw down. You can't show emotions in these situations either. You can't let the dude sitting across from you see you panicking. I can't even imagine having to be on guard 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, not knowing if each day could be my last. What a horrible, horrible feeling. Also, I can't die, because I'm the queen. Coming in at number 4, mind games. Most will know, even people who haven't been to prison, that prison is tough on the mind. It breaks even the most hardened of criminals. However, one former inmate wrote about how awful these mind games can truly be. I quote, "The first day I was assigned to a new unit after being sentenced, DUI 90 days. I got put in a 5-man cell. It wasn't my first time locked up and had been in jail for a few weeks, so I wasn't too nervous. The guys were cool to me all evening. All 4 had done time before in much worse prisons. They were all playing cards and I didn't know the game, so I sat on my bunk reading. They started off saying weird cryptic stuff, random stuff regarding Vaseline and who was cute on the block, etc. It ramps up over the course of an hour, then they start playing strip poker. Meanwhile, I've been hearing every single word they say and studiously ignoring it. They got bored of being subtle and began saying awful stuff about having sex with each other. I ignore everything while secretly getting scared they're going to do something to me. Eventually all four got up, shirtless, and they trapped me on my top bunk and started grabbing at me. I yelled and they collapsed in laughter and spent the next 48 hours telling everyone who would listen. I can't even imagine the psychological warfare that goes on inside of prisons, and I'm definitely aware that that isn't even the worst of it. It's just all I really can talk about in this video. There is far worse, but you'd have to bleep every other word if I said it. In at number 3, we have the sprinkler system. Another inmate story. This one comes to us from Produce This, who stated, I quote, "Honestly, the scariest moment for me was my first walk back to the dorm. You had no idea what you're walking into. All you can think about is what you've heard about and seen on TV. When you get to the back with your clothes and mat roll, everyone is just staring you down. Some are catcalling you basically. Usually this is just to with you though. Other than that, I didn't have any issues. We did have this one guy that was in ISO outside of our dorm. I assume that means isolation, because I know words. He kept being a and hitting the sprinkler head in his room. This caused the hall to flood, which in turn flooded into our dorm. There was a lock room between the hall and outdoor. After about the 3rd time it happened and a few guards had gotten their stuff wet, they told the guard next to them, next time he does it, just lock his in that room and we'll take care of it. Not sure if they were joking or serious at the time or not, but sure enough the hallway flooded the next day. They told us all to step back by our rack. In comes 2 guards with the guy from isolation. They left him in the lock room and walked away. Then the door to our door unlocked. 4 guys whipped that dude's for a good 2 minutes before they came and got him. Stuff stayed dry after that. Yikes, I don't even want to know what happened to that guy. That sounds awful. Don't with the sprinklers, I guess.
Coming at number 5, we have David Sweet and Richard Matt, 2 convicted killers that were locked away in a maximum security prison that were never supposed to get out, but it turns out that several feet of concrete and steel wasn't enough to keep these guys locked up. These 2 were cell neighbors, and they would spend their time talking to one another about how much they hated being in prison and what they should do to get out. Well, it turns out that these dudes were not all talk and actually came up with a plan that was even craftier than a Hollywood movie.
Hey, wait a second. Move.
These guys waited until lights out. When the guard did their final tour, both these guys were still in bed. From there, everything is speculation, but it would seem that these guys both got up and somehow had power tools in their cells. The wild thing is, if you go into the prison report, there weren't any power tools missing. So that means these guys either had someone on the inside who was working with them and snuck them power tools from the prison, or even crazier, there was someone on the outside who was able to pass them power tools on the inside. Well, the police discovered that these 2 men were not in their cells, and the first thing they noticed was that they had makeshift dummies in their beds, so no one could tell that they were not actually in their beds. Then they saw a massive hole in the wall which they followed through, and they were able to break down how they escaped. They cut a hole in the wall and got into the framework of the building. From there, they followed some catwalks to some piping and used the piping to shimmy down 4 stories and get into the sewer system below the prison. After this, they came to a large gate that was chained up with a massive padlock. They cut through the lock and were able to get through the door in no time. From this, they were able to get to a manhole and some fresh clothes that they had stolen, and after that, they were finally out of the prison. One of the best pieces of this crime was the fact that they left behind a note that said, "Have a nice day." That's a pretty savage way to leave your mark behind, so people know that you were not only gone, but also so rude with the whole thing. Thousands of people were questioned in this case as to what happened to these men, but no one really had any answers. Some of the conspiracy theories around this escape say that these men were able to bribe people in the prison, or they might have had dirt on the warden, but that is all hearsay. The only way we'll really be able to get to the bottom of how these men were able to sneak out of a maximum security prison in a single night without anyone knowing is if they get caught. And even if they get caught, they might never spill the beans on this story. And guys, make sure that you like, comment, subscribe, subscribe and hit the notification bell, it really helps us out. Coming in number 2, we have Frank Abagnale. If you've seen the movie Catch Me If You Can, then you actually know a decent amount about one of the best con artists of all time. Frank Abagnale started writing fake checks when he was only a teenager, and he would try to impersonate every professional to try and get ahead. He impersonated doctors, lawyers, pilots, all of them were in the wheelhouse of faces that this guy would try and pull off. There was one time where he posed in front of a bank claiming to be a security guard and stood next to the cash deposit box. He told everyone that the box was out of order and they needed to leave their deposits with him. One by one they left packages of cash with Frank, who had zero affiliation with the bank. He walked off with thousands with this little scheme. Now, eventually the police caught up with him and they were able to arrest him and send him to prison. He was arrested in Britain and he was on a plane headed back to JFK, but right after the plane landed he was able to slip away and was on the run for a few more months before the police caught up with him again. They had him in handcuffs and this time he wasn't going to get away. It seemed that this was a done deal for Frank Abagnale, but when he was in processing he saw a golden opportunity. The corrections officer who was processing him didn't have his paperwork and this seemed very strange, but they were going to lock him up anyways, of course. Well, Frank would slip something in to ensure he was able to make another escape. He told the corrections officer that the reason that he didn't have his paperwork was because he was actually doing an inspection of the prison and was actually a government official. At the time of Frank's arrest, many prisons around America were under inspection because of civil rights violations. So this correction officer took the bait. They thought they could pull a fast one on this so-called inspections officer by giving him the best treatment that he's ever seen, and they would let him be on his way, and that's exactly what they did. Frank was treated like a king for a week straight. He got everything he wanted in the cushiest prison experience imaginable. Then right after, he was able to walk out the doors a free man. Eventually word about this got out to the press and this is what made him a celebrity around the globe. But of course Frank was later arrested again and this time he didn't escape. But when he was released again, he would start working with the CIA to try and crack down on counterfeiting.
Coming in at number 2, we have Observation. This story comes to us from Did You Know Facts, sent in by an anonymous user who recounts their time in prison. They said, I quote, "My family came to visit me on Christmas Day the first year I was in. I was so ashamed that I had a little breakdown the next day and punched the cinder block wall inside my cell. One of the guards invited me to come talk to him. I made the mistake of thinking he was my friend and was talking about the meaning of life and why things happened. He decided he thought I was suicidal, which I wasn't. The next day I was shipped off to a maximum security prison in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, stripped down naked and given a Kevlar smock to wear. They keep the temperature down at 60 degrees, which means that you have to stay huddled in a corner to conserve body heat. Because this was observation, I wasn't allowed to have anything, nothing to read, watch, etc. Naked and cold for an entire week. If you'd like to see what that is like, turn your thermostat down, then take all your clothes off and sleep on the floor of your bathroom with the light on for 6 days straight. No showering either. Wasn't offered a chance to clean myself. That's how I spent New Year's 2007. Observation is not some kind of psychological treatment, it's punishment and mental torture. Sleeping and singing to yourself is all you can do. Too cold to do anything else. Brutal. Now I try to go out of the country for New Year's every single year." Honestly, that is absolutely awful. I can't even begin to imagine what kind of damage that would do to a person's mind. It sounds like the Russian sleep experiment in a way. Being forced to sleep on the floor with the lights on with absolutely nothing to your name. Horrendous. And finally, coming in at number 1, we have a nurse's perspective. This entire list thus far has been the perspectives of prison inmates who were incarcerated and faced grueling conditions. However, what about other people inside those walls, the staff, specifically the nurses? Uploaded by KLC223, who said, I quote, "I worked in a prison as a nurse. Sometimes severely violent or mentally unstable inmates were placed in the chair. This was always a temporary thing. It's basically a big black chair that after the inmate is handcuffed, legs and feet, he/she is then tied to this chair to contain them. Because this risks their circulation being cut off, it required a nurse to be present to check pulses every 15 minutes in hands and feet. They were let out of the chair every 2 hours for a 15-minute period to walk around the cell. So an inmate on PCP comes into the prison intake, wild and combative. He's immediately put into the chair by a set of 5 trained correction officers in SWAT-like gear. I was called from the medical unit to be assigned to monitor his circulation. He's acting out of it, but other than some yelling, he was pretty calm with me being there, but he can only be so wild when tied to a chair anyways. The 2-hour time frame was reached to let him walk this cell. As soon as he had his handcuffs unlocked, he went completely insane, biting the officers in the arms and shoulders and headbutting them as well as punching them in the face. I had to run out of the cell and back off as quickly as I could. I managed to get out fine, but the officers had to restrain him immediately. All 5 had to go to the hospital for either broken bones, stitches, or chunks bitten out their arms. It was all pretty horrific. I mean, this entire thing is horrific. I've never heard of the chair. I had no idea that was happening. Is that normal? And I just didn't know. Honestly, it all sounds pretty strange to me. I didn't know people were getting locked in chairs.
Coming in at number 3, we have Glenn Stark Chambers. If you're the one on the outside looking in, it would seem that getting out of prison would be one of the hardest things you could ever do. You would have to be some sort of mastermind that could rival Batman. You have to come up with a plan that has every little detail figured out, because one slip up could have you back behind bars or in solitary confinement. But then you hear some of these stories of how people were able to break free from prison, and you realize you could really be anyone and you could sneak out. You just need to be bold enough to do so. This is pretty much how Glenn Stark Chambers was able to get out of prison. Chambers was a murderer, and he was actually supposed to be dead before he ever got the chance to slip out of prison. He was sentenced to death row, and everything was teed up for lethal injection, but then his sentencing was brought down to life in prison. I'm not sure which one is worse. Well, for Chambers, spending life in prison was a much better alternative because it gave him the time to plan his escape. So one day, Glenn was working in the furniture packing area in the prison. You had to build couches and then put them into boxes, load them onto a van, and the van would take them to who knows where. Well, Glenn had the split-second idea that why not, instead of putting a couch into one of these boxes, I put myself into one of these boxes. He got his prison buddies to pack him up in there and then load it onto a van, and guess what? Nobody noticed. He was loaded onto the back of a van and taken right out of the prison, and not a single person realized that one of the prisoners was missing from the group, not until they did head count later that night. But by that time, Chambers was long gone. The van that Chambers got into eventually pulled over. Chambers used this opportunity to burst out of the box and change his clothes. He was smart enough to bring some civilian clothes to change into, and right after that he was out of the back of the van and off running. Chambers was being held in the Florida Polk Corrections Facility. Chambers already had family in Florida, so it's suspected that he first ran off to go meet his family, who then helped him hide when he was on the run. There have been reports of him both in Alabama and in Florida, but none of these sightings have turned into an arrest. Coming in number 2, we have Empress Matilda. In the year 1142, there was a war raging across England, and the Empress Matilda was being held captive. Her cousin Stephen knew that the throne was his and he was going to take it right from her hands, and he imprisoned her and took over the country. Well, Matilda wasn't going to take this lying down. She waited until winter and came up with a plan for escape. There was a large lake that separated her castle from the Wellington Castle, and she knew that if she could make it across this lake, she could find sanctuary there. So she crafted her own ice skates, put on a large white cape for both warmth and camouflage, and took off skating across the lake one night. She was able to make it to the Wallingford Castle, and eventually there was a truce made in the war. And coming in at the number 1 spot, we have Yoshi Shiratori. Probably one of the wildest escape stories you will ever hear. Yoshi Shiratori escaped from prison 4 times. This guy refused to stay in prison. First, Shiratori was arrested after a short trial, and he was found guilty of murder, and he was sentenced to life in prison, and they slapped on another 20 years on top of that. Well, Shiratori didn't like this one bit, and when no one was looking, he climbed the walls of the prison and took off on foot. That's one way to break out of prison. You just use sheer upper body strength. This was in 1936, and he would spend a few years on the run, not needing to worry about the crushing pain of a prison. But then in 1942 he was caught again and would use a similar tactic of scaling the walls to sneak out of prison life. You think after breaking out of prison twice you would never go back, but you would be wrong.
Some people never learn.
Shiratori was caught again in 1944, and this time he would come up with his second most famous escape plan, but in my opinion, his most ingenious. He took some miso soup that they served him in his cell, and then he used it to rust the lock on his handcuffs and the lock on his cell so they could both easily be broken. Then after everyone went to sleep, he snapped them both open and was on the run before anyone woke up. He would spend another 2 years in the wild running from the police, but when he got caught the next time, he would be sentenced to death. Well, Shiratori wasn't about to die in prison. If you haven't realized by now, this guy isn't someone who you tell what to do. So Shiratori tunneled out of the prison and escaped again. He was caught one final time when he found a police officer and admitted that he was a convict, and then he was returned to jail. He wasn't given the death sentence, though he was eventually released from prison in the 60s after he served his full sentence.
Number 5. John Dillinger. John Dillinger is one of America's most prolific bank robbers. Hearing his name calls to mind fast-paced car chases, slick fedoras, revolvers, and banknotes. And for good reason. Dillinger managed to hit 24 banks in his lifetime. And I couldn't find any information on whether or not this is true. I'm pretty sure he holds the world record for most banks robbed. I have a strong feeling that he does. He was imprisoned multiple times over his crime career, but you couldn't keep a good career criminal like this down because he escaped prison multiple times. Now the first time, Dillinger's gang disguised themselves as police officers, but his most famous escape was during 1934. After robbing the East Chicago First National Bank, Dillinger fired at a police officer, sealing his fate and landing him with some pretty serious charges, as up until then he was only charged with robberies. After the heist, a fire broke out at a hotel the gang was laying low at, leading to a tip that led authorities to Dillinger, who shipped him away to Crown Point, Indiana, and treated him as one of their most dangerous prisoners. All of them expecting him to try and escape again. And they were right to think that, because he did. Dillinger was surrounded by 6 guards at all times, armed and ready. But despite this, and the little free time he had, Dillinger was still able to carve a fake pistol out of an old piece of washboard using razor blades. Dillinger used his homemade wooden pistol to threaten the guards at, well, not quite gunpoint, but wood point, I guess, and forced them to free him and lead him out of jail. Dillinger jacked a car from a nearby alleyway, and with hostages under his wing, Dillinger had escaped again. This would lead to Edgar Hoover tightening up an FBI task force just to hunt down John Dillinger, placing a $10,000 bounty on his head. This led to an accomplice of Dillinger ratting him out, leading to his fatal final encounter with the police in an alleyway outside a Chicago movie theater, ending the legendary gangster's crime spree. Want to hear more about weird crimes? Subscribe to Top 5 Scary for way more every day. Let's keep going. Number 4. The Texas 7. The Texas 7 refers to a gang of 7 highly dangerous inmates who ganged together in 2000 to hatch an escape plan from John B. Connolly Unit, a maximum security state prison in South Texas. The group comprised all kinds of nasty criminals, some on death row. Some of them were even serving 99-year sentences. All of them were serving long sentences with no chance of parole. And as such, they looked for other options to regain their freedom. Now what they had was strength in numbers. On December 13, 2000, the group launched their plan into action. They'd waited for the slowest part of the day when guard patrols were at their most thin, and plain and simple, started knocking officers out. They would have one member of the 7 beckon an officer over and another restraining and knocking him unconscious from behind. From here, they kept taking pages out of Agent 47's notebook and hid the officers' bodies, tied them up, and placed in a locked door, and stole their uniforms, credit cards, and ID from the victims. They then posed as police to ward off suspicion. From here, 3 of the men made their way to the back of the prison, changed into civilian disguises, and posed as a surveillance camera crew to install new monitors. They knocked out another guard and raided the guard tower and stole numerous weapons to take with them. The 4 who'd stayed behind stole a prison maintenance truck, picked up their co-conspirators, and fled the scene. Their newfound freedom barely lasted though, as the men had left a trail of evidence and were on the FBI's most wanted. Not helping matters was that mere days after the escape, they robbed a store, which eventually led to the death of an officer, leading to a $500,000 bounty for the capture of the Texas 7. A year later, after several tips, the FBI apprehended what members were still living who had scattered across the country. Those they found are back in prisons, unlikely to ever pull something like that off again.
Number 5. Randy Greenawalt and Gary Tyson. As a 2-for-1 bonus for our viewers, our first entry on this list details the imprisonment, escape, and brutal rampage of 2 prisoners from the Florence State Prison in Arizona, USA. In 1974, Randy Greenawalt and his brother James were held on suspicion for the murder of a truck driver named Stanley Sandage. The brothers had shot the driver and taken his wallet before being arrested when they tried to purchase stereo equipment with the victim's credit card. The authorities realized that the killing was extremely similar to the death of another driver, Henry Weber, 4 days earlier. The 2 brothers were charged with the murders, but Randy was able to avoid the death penalty by testifying against his brother. He was sent to Florence State Prison where he met Gary Tyson. Tyson had attempted to escape escaped several times and was serving a life sentence for stabbing a prison guard. The two men formed a plan together to try and escape with the help of Tyson's 3 sons, who showed up to visiting day with a concealed shotgun and helped the 2 prisoners to overpower the guards and escape, with plans of escaping to a ranch in Mexico. They quickly ran into trouble when their car blew a tire. A kind stranger driving with his wife, infant son, and teenage niece came across them and tried to see if they needed help. They were taken prisoner by the convicts and taken into the desert, where they were shot and left for dead, while Greenawalt and the Tysons fled in the family's Mazda. They made contact with a woman Greenawalt had become pen pals with, who bought them a truck and ammunition, plans of making their way to an airplane that Gary had chartered for their escape. The police caught wind of this, and the gang was forced to try and make alternate arrangements. They made their way to Texas, where they killed a couple of newlyweds and took their car. Days later, they were met with a roadblock, which they ruthlessly barreled their way through, before being met with another one 6 miles down the road. The officers opened fire on the gang, hitting one of the Tyson sons who was driving. The remaining 2 brothers and Greenawalt were captured, but Gary Tyson got away, although he was found dead in the desert 11 days later, having died a slow death of exposure to the elements. The brothers were sentenced to life in prison, and Gary was executed by lethal injection after spending 2 decades on death row. Number 4. Lyda Southard, the Black Widow. While not all marriages end well, and some can accurately be described as unmitigated disasters, few have ended as poorly as the various marriages of Lyda Southard. But, for all her faults, no one can say she didn't take the vow of till death do us part seriously. Lyda married her first husband, Robert Dooley, in the year 1912. For a while, it seemed a good match, with Dooley's brother Edward joining them on their ranch in Twin Falls, Idaho, and the couple having a daughter named Lorraine 2 years later. When she was a year old, Lorraine suddenly died, having apparently drunk tainted water from a dirty well. Tragedy struck again later that year when Edward died of food poisoning. 2 months after that, Robert died of typhoid fever, and Lyda was left the only surviving family member. Fortunately for her, she had taken out life insurance policies on each of her family members and had over $4,500 to try and start over after this tragedy. She soon married William G. McCaffell, becoming the stepmother to his 3-year-old daughter. When his daughter fell ill and died, the couple decided to move to Montana together, but within a year, William died of influenza, leaving poor Lyda a widow once again. Bad luck seemed to follow her wherever she went, with her next husbands, Harlan C. Lewis and Edward F. Meyer, both dying of sudden illnesses within 4 months of marrying Lyda. A relative of her first husband started to notice the pattern and had his family's corpses exhumed and examined, proving that all had died of arsenic poisoning. The other bodies showed the same results when tested, and Lyda was arrested before she had a chance to murder her 5th husband, Paul Southard, for the insurance money. She was sentenced to 10 years to life in the old Idaho State Penitentiary, where she remained as a model prisoner for the next 10 years. The guards eventually stopped watching her as closely as they should have, and in 1931 she managed to remove a bar from her prison window and use her bed sheets to construct a rope in order to escape. She remained at large for over a year until she was found in Topeka, Kansas, married to her 6th husband, Harry Whitlock. She was taken into custody for another 10 years before being released in 1941. She died of a heart attack in 1958, whereupon her 7th husband, Hal Shaw, likely breathed an unconscious sigh of relief.
Number 3. El Chapo. El Chapo, otherwise known as Joaquin Guzman, is one of the most notorious drug lords to ever live. He founded the Sinaloa cartel in the 80s and dominated the trade. Over his long career, he was captured and arrested several times, but made a prolific habit of his escapes. His first arrest was in 1993, and it didn't stop him from running operations at all out of the minimum security prison, but it wouldn't always be this easy. In 2001, the cartel bribed the guards, who loaded Guzman into a laundry cart and simply wheeled him out of the prison like it was nothing. The next 14 years would see Guzman continuing out operations as normal, undeterred by his short time in the clink. He was incarcerated again in 2014, and this time the escape was a lot more elaborate, and he had a lot more help. In Altiplano Federal Prison, Guzman disappeared entirely in July, and authorities were stunned to discover that the cartel had been digging a tunnel for months that led directly from a small 2-foot hole in the showers. The tunnel spanned nearly a mile and was fitted with lights, ventilation, and most amazingly, had a motorcycle all ready to go for Guzman to ride to freedom, all the way to a cinder block house that had been constructed at the end of it. He would manage to elude capture again, for a bit at least, until 2016, where he would face extradition. He's currently incarcerated again, and knowing his reputation, Who knows if he'll stay there. Number 2, Richard Lee McNair. Richard Lee McNair's story is perhaps one of the most wild prison break stories I had ever read. It's probably the most wild one on this list, to be honest. McNair was raised by a police officer, but would find himself straying from the law when in 1987 he robbed a grain storage facility in North Dakota, where he fatally shot at a man and wounded another. He was convicted and sentenced to 2 consecutive life sentences and a burglary charge on top of that. Unhappy with his new surroundings, McNair would sneak through a ventilation pipe in North Dakota State Pen in 1993, although he was swiftly recaptured. Now, one escape from prison is already pretty cool, but it was his second escaped attempt that was infinitely more impressive. McNair was eventually transferred to a federal prison in Pollock, Louisiana. McNair was assigned to the work detail in the manufacturing room, where he would repair broken items, including patching up old mail bags, which inspired him to hatch an ingenious plan. In secret, McNair built himself what he called his escape pod, a small compartment with a breathing tube he would hide inside. Now, he hid himself inside the mailbag pile, shrink wrapped and forklifted to a nearby warehouse outside of the prison. He mailed himself out of jail. He says the heat was unimaginable, that it felt like being inside a furnace, and that he was afraid he was going to pass out. When the warehouse staff broke for lunch, McNair cut himself free and fled the prison as fast as he could. He was apprehended by a local police officer, but managed to convince the cop that he was just a local jogger and not that escaped convict everybody's looking for. McNair fled to Canada, living across British Columbia, Ontario, and eventually settling in New Brunswick. Having successfully escaped the long arm of the law and living on the lam, fighting the law and winning. Take that, The Clash. Well, for about a year, at least. Despite managing his impressive escape, he was widely known, featuring on America's Most Wanted, and had to live a pretty quiet lifestyle. He was cited in Canada multiple times. Eventually, he would end up being busted for driving a stolen white van in 2007, describing his capture as just being bad luck. Just one of those days, McNair said. After a year on the lam, McNair was returned to the States, where he is now interred in a supermax prison deemed for prisoners where maximum security isn't enough. But I'm sure he's plotting a way to get out of this one. And finally, number 1, Alcatraz. Alcatraz was built to wear down the hopes of the most rebellious prisoners. The infamous San Fran Island was known as the Rock for how heavily guarded and seemingly inescapable it was. Of course, if you know about the movie Escape from Alcatraz, then you already know in 1962, 3 daredevil convicts did the impossible and managed to escape the unescapable. Between 1934 and 1962, there were 13 failed escape attempts. But I guess if anything, that just served as inspiration for inmates Frank Morris and brothers John and Clarence Anglin, who would prove everyone wrong. They had planned this for months. Frank Morris brought in his accomplices John and Clarence and their 4th accomplice, Alan West, who had all met each other from previous incarcerations and had a pretty good thing going. During the days, they stole spoons and discarded saw blades from the workyard and spent upwards of 7 months widening the ventilation ducts in each of their cells, with Frank Morris loudly playing the accordion to conceal their handiwork. That's hilarious, by the way. Whenever they weren't working on it, they covered the holes with gray painted cardboard. The ducts would lead to a tunnel where the 4 men had stored a 6 by 14 foot raft that the men had made out of discarded raincoats, held together with soap and sealed with heat from the steam pipes. These guys were unbelievably crafty, because check this out too. They assembled dummy heads out of paper mache, hair from the barbers, and painted them as realistically as they possibly could. They stuffed laundry and discarded rags under their blankets with their paper heads poking out while they escaped so it looked like they were sleeping. That is hilarious. That's like Ferris Bueller stuff. Unfortunately, on the night of the escape, Alan West was left behind when he couldn't get the grill of his duct off. The other men, however, weren't willing to wait around, grabbed the raft, slid down to the roof, and snuck to the shore. Now, what happened next is lost to time. The prevailing theory is that the men drowned in the harsh waters on the way out, although the Anglin family claims that the men had escaped. Regardless of the truth, the men did the impossible.
Number 3, Nikolai Dzumagalia, the Metal Fang. Nikolai was born in 1952 in the Soviet Union. He went to railway school before being conscripted into the Soviet Army. After his service ended, he tried to go to university or become a driver, but failed at both. He worked various odd jobs, including that of a sailor, a forwarder, an electrician, a bulldozer operator, and a firefighter. He spent a lot of this time fantasizing about and planning murders, committing his first in 1979 on a woman he had encountered traveling across a rural path. He committed 5 more murders that year, whose victims he then cannibalized, and may have committed more if not for the fact that one night he got extremely drunk and accidentally shot one of his co-workers. He was arrested, diagnosed with schizophrenia, and sent to a mental institution. He was released less than a year later, and he resumed his murders, committing 2 more. His 9th murder is what resulted in him being captured, as he had invited guests over to his home. He brought one of the guests into a different room, killed them, and began dismembering them with an axe. The other guests walked in on this and fled the scene before calling the police. They came to get him, but were so shocked at the sight of him that he managed to escape before being captured the next day. He was declared insane and incarcerated in a mental hospital where he remained for the next 8 years. In 1989, while being transferred to a different hospital, he managed to hijack the vehicle and escape. He was able to avoid capture for 2 years, killing at least 1 more person while at large, before he allowed himself to be caught stealing sheep. His hope was that he would not be recognized and could go to jail for a relatively minor offense. The story he gave the officers didn't add up, and a colonel familiar with the case was sent to check the situation out. He identified Nikolai, and he was sent back to a mental hospital where he remains to this day. Number 2. Ted Bundy. The most well-known of the monsters on this list, Ted Bundy was a cold-hearted murderer who would feign injury in order to get close to women and then attack them into unconsciousness in order to take them to a secondary location where he would take advantage of them before strangling them to death. He would often return to the bodies of the victims where he would subject the corpses to further indignities before decomposition made this impossible. He later confessed to 30 murders, but the authorities believe his real body count is likely extremely larger. In one of the first examples of computers being used to investigate serial killer crimes, authorities compiled all the information they had based on witness statements to come up with likely suspects, and the computer produced a list of 26 names, one of them Bundy's. At the same time, detectives made a list manually of their 100 best suspects. When Bundy's name appeared on both lists, he became their number 1 suspect, but word came out that he had already been arrested. A highway patrol officer had seen Bundy cruising a residential area and fleeing upon seeing the police car. When searched, they found a crowbar, handcuffs, a ski mask, rope, and an ice pick, among other suspicious items in Bundy's car. He was soon linked to and found guilty in a kidnapping case until the authorities gathered more evidence to charge him with the murders. In Utah State Prison, he attempted an escape and was placed in solitary confinement for several weeks before being transferred to Garfield County Jail. He was then taken to the Pitkin County Courthouse, where he chose to act as his own attorney. This allowed him to avoid having to wear handcuffs and shackles, and during a court recess he was allowed into the court library to research his case, where he snuck away from his guards and fled through the library window. He made his way to an Aspen hunting cabin, which he broke into and stole food and a rifle from. He became lost in the mountains and eventually found his way back to Aspen, where he stole a car but was soon apprehended by authorities. He was sent back to prison where he acquired a hacksaw blade and spent 6 months sawing a hole in the bars in his window. He squeezed through the gap and into the crawl space, which led to the chief jailer's apartment, where he stole clothes and walked right out the front door. During the 2 months of freedom following his second escape, Bundy managed to kill 2 sorority girls and 1 12-year-old girl before eventually being arrested for driving a stolen car near the Alabama state line and being sent back to prison where he remained until his eventual execution. Number 1. Earl Nelson. When Earl Nelson was 2 years old, his parents died and he was sent to live with his grandmother and her 2 younger children. Even from his young childhood days, he exhibited self-loathing and morbid behavior, being expelled from his primary school as a 7-year-old. He got even worse after being hit by a streetcar and being knocked out for almost a week. Upon awakening, he began to suffer from intense headaches and memory loss, and his behavior became more and more erratic. He was in and out of prison as a young adult for relatively minor charges such as trespassing and larceny. He eventually ended up in Los Angeles County Jail, where he remained for 5 months before escaping and joining the Navy. He was committed to the Napa State Mental Hospital by a Navy psychologist who described him as living in a constitutional psychotic state. The doctors at the institution described him as suffering from hallucinations and paranoid delusions, but they deemed him relatively harmless. In his time at the hospital, he managed to escape 3 times, causing the staff to nickname him Houdini and eventually stopped searching for him. He was sent back to the hospital after trying to assault a minor, but escaped 2 more times before eventually being discharged in 1925. The next year, he began his string of murders. He would travel the country pretending to be a harmless traveling Christian, looking for women with rooms to rent. He would then be invited into the women's homes, whereupon he would assault and murder them by strangling them. Not always in that order. A witness who saw him near the scene of the crime described him as a dark and stocky man with long arms and large hands, causing the newspapers to began calling Earl Nelson the Gorilla Man, or the Dark Strangler. He managed to cross the country, killing at least 16 women, as well as 2 of their children, before making his way to Canada to avoid the growing manhunt. While in the country, he killed 2 more people before authorities were able to track him down and arrest him at a nearby train station. He escaped from the prison that very same night and boarded a train going south back into the States. The train happened to be carrying several members of the local police force who recaptured him and took him back to prison. He was found guilty and sentenced to death. Although he tried to appeal this for reasons of insanity, he was hanged in Winnipeg in early 1928 at the age of 30 years old after killing at least 23 people and having escaped incarceration on 7 separate occasions.